had been funding his work through grants awarded by the Office of Naval Research. But when he approached them about his cold fusion research, they didn't think it was a good fit. After some shuffling around, Pons resubmitted to the Office of Advanced Energy Projects of the Department of Energy. The office had a bit of a reputation as the Office of Hail Marys. Its administrator, Richard Gajewski, once called it the home of orphans and infants. What he meant by that was his office was the last chance for projects that were considered too crazy for other departments. Pie-in-the-sky pitches that still deserved at least a little bit of funding. Gajewski had a lot of power in this office, and he liked to pick favorites. As it happened, one of his longest-running funding programs was for a professor at BYU, Stephen Jones. Jones was one of the experts in a niche area called muon-catalyzed fusion. A muon is a particle similar to an electron. It's just 207 times as massive. A muon can replace an electron orbiting a nucleus of deuterium. Because a muon is so much heavier, its orbital radius is almost 200 times as small. This allows two atoms to sit much closer together, which vastly increases the odds of fusion. Muon-catalyzed fusion can and often does occur at room temperature. After it was first demonstrated in 1956, for about a decade researchers scrambled to perfect it, hoping that it would unlock an immense new energy source. And in fact, a New York Times article from 1956 even referred to it as, quote, cold fusion. The issue is that the numbers just weren't there. It wasn't frequent enough to sustain itself as an energy source. But the concept never fully died. Steve Jones at BYU was one of its true believers. Gajewski clearly took a shine to him. He'd funded Jones for 6 years now, giving him around $250K a year by 1988. It was a strong show of faith, but Jones knew his clock was ticking. Gajewski was getting pressure from his bosses to call it quits on Jones's work. Muon-catalyzed fusion was as dead now as it was 30 years earlier. He needed to pivot. Inspiration came in September 1988 when Gajewski sent Jones a proposal. The title was The Behavior of Electrochemically Compressed Hydrogen and Deuterium, and it was submitted by Stanley Pons and Martin Fleischmann. Jones was intended to act as a neutral referee, one of 5. The proposal was confidential. The cover specifically mentioned, quote, to use the information contained in the proposal for evaluation purposes only. You can probably guess where this is going. Later, Jones and BYU's legal team would release a detailed timeline of his research on fusion, supported by pages and pages from Jones's own notebook.
BYU has documents such as these lab notebooks showing their work goes back to at least 1986.
And if you watch his testimony in Congress, he will hammer home the point that he'd been working on this for years.
Deuterium into metals is going to lead to fusion, which we had in early '86. I should say, by the way, that this has been funded by this same Advanced Energy Projects, this particular idea, cold nuclear fusion, since '86. We pioneered that in May of 1986.
Jones has claimed that while his primary focus had been on muon-catalyzed fusion, he had spent some time and funding working on more traditional fusion work, like that of Pons and Fleischmann, even before he saw their proposal. And this is technically true. In March 1986, Jones had a chance run-in with a geophysicist, Paul Palmer, who had an idea that fusion can take place within the Earth via extreme pressure. They began to spitball the idea of piezonuclear fusion. Piezo means pressure in Latin. In a memo dated April 1st, 1986, Jones wrote, "Could it be that metal hydrides provide an environment conducive to confinement and fusion of hydrogen isotopes?" And on April 7th, Jones, although he never actually uses the word electrolysis, he does write down several different metals. Among them is palladium. In one of his annual updates to Gajewski, he mentioned his piezonuclear fusion idea. 2 of Jones's graduate students, in May 1986, began experiments where they would load hydrogen into metals via electrolysis. But after months of attempts, nothing useful came of the experiments. In September, they abandoned the idea. The most they got out of it was 2 term papers. And so, if we want to be lawyers about it, Jones's group did, independent from Pons and Fleischmann, come up with a cold fusion concept as early as 1986. But they soon put the idea on a 2-year-long hiatus. Jones's later explanation for the hiatus is that they were waiting on a colleague to build an ultra-sensitive detector that would allow them to continue the experiments. This detector was indeed finished around August of 1988, and we know from Jones's own notebook that he assembled his team for a meeting on August 24th, and they discussed restarting the fusion project. But then, and this is where it gets a little suspect, his notebook has a 29-day gap where he does not mention the fusion project. And then finally, he notes on September 20th that he received the Pons and Fleischmann proposal from Gajewski. It is only after this point that his group begins to start up experiments again. The whole saga is full of coincidences both in timing and in location. What are the odds that it's two Utah labs, just 40 miles apart, that would be racing to unlock the secrets of fusion? What we do know for sure is that Jones and his team jumped into action only after they had read Pons and Fleischmann's proposal, at a time when his funding was on the verge of ending. And so, by late September, his group was starting up experiments, and Jones wrote back to Gajewski that the proposal should be rejected. Or at least, he needed some clarifications first. And so, he begins to write to them anonymously. To Pons and Fleischmann, here is an anonymous reviewer asking very basic questions, clearly of the opinion that this experiment won't work. Only when they had shared enough details for him to replicate the experiment in its entirety did he change his tune and give it the thumbs up. Pons and Fleischmann had managed to guess that the reviewer was Jones because one of his critiques was that they hadn't cited a 1986 paper by him. And then one day, Gajewski phones up Pons and suggests that since Jones had worked on similar stuff before, they maybe work out a collaboration. From the perspective of Pons and Fleischmann, this was outrageous. Pons had refused to talk about this project to anyone outside Fleischmann or his own family for years, and now as soon as they submit a grant application, they had a physicist trying to force himself onto their paper. Although Pons and Jones have a friendly phone conversation, deep down Pons feels like their work has been stolen. Pons tells the patent officer at U of U that they may have a legal dispute on their hands, and he makes a call to a childhood friend. Gary Triggs grew up with Pons in North Carolina. He was a charming country lawyer who was not afraid to get his hands dirty. When the dispute with Jones's group began to heat up, Pons had Triggs fly into town to help him re-strategize. Triggs also acted as a confidant, one of the few people Pons trusted without question. Even before Cold Fusion, Pons had used Triggs as an attack dog when he got into some hot water. At least 2 prior collaborations involving Dow Chemical and Synthetech used Pons as a researcher. When those companies couldn't reproduce his results, they asked for his data. Pons blocked them by getting Triggs to send cease and desist letters. One of Triggs' first acts in the Cold Fusion saga was to have Pons call up Gajewski and try to get him to admit to manufacturing this whole mess to help out his buddy Jones. If he said anything incriminating, they never did anything with it. Both groups go into overdrive trying to gather data in a race to get their paper out first. The U of U group is working 24/7, swapping out in shifts. The dispute begins to boil over around February, when Gajewski tells Pons that he's putting a freeze on their funding until the dispute is resolved. They've now lost all trust in Gajewski. They start to become paranoid. Both groups escalate the issue to the heads of their respective schools. Both the U of U and BYU administrations take over the negotiations. They arrange for sit-down talks. The U of U team visits BYU and tour the lab on February 23rd. Jones's team is impressed by how well made Pons and Fleischmann's cells are, and Pons and Fleischmann are impressed by BYU's radiation detector. But Jones tells them that he's been at this for 2 years and he wants to publish now. Pons and Fleischmann beg him for 18 more months. They need more time. But Jones says he can't wait. He agrees to cancel a talk later that week, but he's been scheduled to speak at a major conference in May, the American Physical Society. Can't you present something else, they asked him? No, he says he can't. He already submitted an abstract, and in it, he mentions cold fusion. He's given them a no-win scenario. Pons and Fleischmann are at a loss. The final negotiation is an agreement to publish back-to-back submissions to the same journal. After some debate, they agree on Nature, one of the most prestigious in the world. At the end of the meeting, both sides shook hands, but no paper had been signed. Nothing written had cemented the deal. Neither side was happy, and any pleasantries were just performances. Reportedly, by the time Pons and Fleischmann had walked back to their cars, they were calling Jones a thief. What if one of the papers got rejected and the other accepted? That paper would get all the credit. They believe there is only the nuclear option left. Go public immediately.
BYU fusion researcher Stephen Jones says the U breached an agreement with Brigham Young University by announcing its fusion discovery to the media last month. Jones says the two universities had agreed to announce their separate findings simultaneously.
There was no commitment, no promise of any sort that we wouldn't go public.
Around March 13th, Jones gets the feeling that Pons and Fleischman are going to screw him over. He phones them and they tell him something that is either, quote, a threat or a warning. He can't tell which. And so they hold their press conference on March 23rd without any heads up to BYU. At the press conference, a reporter asks if they are aware of any other group doing similar work. VP of Research James Brophy takes the mic. He says he wasn't aware of any other group. Something he knows for a fact is a lie.
And with fusion coming to the forefront, the big rivalry between BYU and the University of Utah is no longer over football.
Okay, so now what's the deal here? Is it because somebody stole it?
No, BYU says that we were working on it together and that he came out first so he could get all the publicity.
Imagine that.
Fleischman and Pons will go on to say many years later that they did not name their discovery cold fusion, that it was Steve Jones who was responsible for that. A couple weeks later at a conference in Italy, Fleischman and Jones will have a private conversation in the hall. Reportedly, Fleischman will apologize for how things got out of hand, but you can't put that cat back in the bag. By going public early, they had doomed their careers. Jones had found out about the betrayal when the Financial Times called him asking for comment. Jones was furious, but he feels a sense of relief at the same time. Knowing he's been betrayed rather than waiting for it is almost freeing. He goes on vacation with his family for the Easter weekend. They mail the paper to Nature as soon as possible. No one from his team will be going to the airport on March 24th to meet with Marvin Hawkins. And that leads us back to where we started. Marvin Hawkins, Pons' PhD student, clutching an envelope in a FedEx at the airport. A TV crew is there to film the meeting that won't be taking place. He'll end up submitting the paper and going home. Hawkins' name didn't make it into the history books the same way Pons and Fleischman's did. He's not a protagonist, but his story is still worth telling. Marvin Hawkins was 27 here. In the fall of '88, he was pretty much wrapped up with his PhD work. The only thing left for him to graduate was to write his thesis. If he focused on writing, he'd be out in just a couple months. It was in his best interest to try and get it done sooner rather than later, because after all, he was the sole source of income for a family of 5. He had taken a 2-year break from school for his Mormon missionary work, so he was a bit behind his academic peers. He needed a decent paying job. But in October of 1988, Stanley Pons, chair of the chemistry department, approached him with an offer. He was working on an incredibly interesting fusion experiment. Well, actually, it was more than interesting, it sounded groundbreaking. The sort of thing that could win a Nobel Prize. It would certainly delay his graduation, and it wouldn't pay him very much, just $10K a year. But Marvin recognized it as the once-in-a-career opportunity that it was. And to work with Martin Fleischman, too? When it came to chemistry, that man was a god. Stanley Pons was a secretive man. Outside his family and his mentor Fleischman, he barely told anyone about this. His wife worked as a secretary, and up until August, he'd had his son Joey run most of the experiments. But he was getting married that month and left the lab. With a vacancy to fill, Pons approached Marvin. Part of why he chose Marvin was that he knew he could set up experiments on his own. He wouldn't need outside help. Fewer chance of a leak. Marvin worked for months, and to hear him tell it, without much help from Pons and Fleischman, on developing the cells that would soon become world famous.
Does everyone you build now work?
No. As with any scientific endeavor, you've got some build-up, some mistakes, some reevaluation, some new processes that you want to incorporate.
As January turned into February, it was clear to him that Pons' group was in a race with someone at BYU. Whoever published first was guaranteed to make it into the history books, and whoever was second might, if they were lucky, get a single mention at the end of a long paragraph. They began to pull 24/7 shifts. Quote, there were times where I would go home for 3 or 4 hours and sleep and then get up and go back. And that happened for a month and a half. No weekends, no nothing. Your kids kind of tend to wonder who you are. Jamie Hawkins, Marvin's wife of 5 years, said simply, it brought on a whole new meaning of the term widow. Having Marvin away from home was difficult, Jamie said, but we could see it was for a great purpose, so that made it a little easier to deal with. Quote, obviously it's been very stressful on it. She's been very supportive. She's even come in from time to time and helped me collect data just to try and maintain some kind of relationship. It's not been horrible, but it's been hard. His kids missed him at home. Their daughter was old enough to understand it was important for her daddy's job, but their younger son was emotional. Pons seemed to recognize what a sacrifice Marvin was making, especially as a young father. Quote, Stan would call me numerous times and say, Jamie, I'm sorry that Marvin's never home, but realize soon Hawkins, Pons, and Fleischman's name will be in the lights. Hawkins' name never made it on to the paper. 2 days before the announcement, Pons gives him the bad news. The school, for legal reasons, thinks it's better if it's just him and Fleischman on the paper. Marvin is devastated. In the couple days after the March 23rd announcement, the energy around the Utah campus was frantic. News crews were everywhere, and everyone wanted to catch a glimpse of the famous cold fusion cells. Someone had also allegedly stolen the transparencies Pons and Fleischman had used in their press conference. And the day after the announcement, Fleischman took a plane back to Europe, where he'd be for a few weeks. Now, that meant Pons had been left alone in Utah without his mentor, receiving more public attention than he'd ever had in his entire life. Phone calls were ringing all hours of the day, news crews wanted to interview him, his email account got hacked. They had to change his home phone number just to stop the ringing. In a profile for the Deseret News, Pons described himself with one word: scared.
Tensions can get very high. Emotions can get absolutely destroyed.
That's a lot of pressure.
It's not that much more. For me, he's the same guy. The kids say, yeah, there's Dad on TV, and they run on and play. We don't know when we're going to have dinner. People want to talk all the time. We always say we're normal. We're still the same as ever.
Soon, a mysterious man from MIT would roll up, uninvited, and began asking questions. He only left when Pons tried to contact security. So with all of this context in mind, Pons realizes on March 26th that some of his lab books were missing. With Fleischman gone, the only other person who could have the notes was Marvin Hawkins. And so, Pons calls up another grad student, Mark Anderson, and asks him to take over a bit of the work from Marvin Hawkins. Here is where it gets odd. Hawkins attests that Pons and Fleischman asked him to make a copy of the notebooks and protect the original. And so he did that, making copies and then putting the originals in his brother's safety deposit box. After weeks of endless hours stuck in the lab, Hawkins and his family go on a ski trip for the holiday weekend, which Pons had supposedly offered to pay for. On Monday the 27th, Pons calls Hawkins and urgently tells him he needs the notebooks that day. It's not much of a leap for Pons to assume that Hawkins is upset with his name being left off the paper and that he may have taken the notes for leverage. Unaware that Pons suspects him of anything nefarious, Marvin leaves the ski trip and drives into Salt Lake City to drop off the photocopies of the notebooks and then returns back to his family vacation. But Pons is not happy with just the photocopies, and when Marvin checks in via the phone, Pons tells him he needs the originals right now. He essentially accuses him of stealing the notebooks. Pons and Hawkins' stories contradict each other quite a bit here. Pons claims he got a call from the Mormon church saying the notebooks were with them, and he should come pick them up. He alleges that Hawkins tried to sell the notebooks for millions of dollars or as some sort of religious donation. When Hawkins returned to the lab, Pons threatened to send the police after him. Eventually, Hawkins returns the notebooks, realizes he's been replaced, and leaves for his vacation a third time, but in a significantly worse mood. And finally, on April 4th, he receives a letter from Stanley Pons. He's been fired. Hawkins immediately goes to the administration and says he'll go to the media if they don't rectify the situation. He even calls Fleischman, who tells him he'll try and talk some sense into Stan. A day later, Pons and Hawkins sit down and have a meeting with two neutral third parties. In it, they agree that Hawkins should be allowed to finish his thesis, and his name will appear on the paper in the form of an errata. Marvin Hawkins, despite everything Pons put him through, still defends him to this day. Forgetting to add an author to a paper, especially when there are only 3 total, is not a very common mistake. When the errata was published, it raised eyebrows across the field, but it was not even the most suspicious correction. A small detail, easy to miss, suggested something deeply wrong about the science. A mistake so fundamental that some would accuse them of fraud. When Stanley Pons addressed a crowd of 7,000 chemists at a stadium in Dallas, he was their rock star. He had delivered not just a win to the field of chemistry, but he had done what so many physicists had been failing to do for decades. Chemistry and physics are sibling fields, and they go hand in hand. But the scientists who study them naturally develop rivalries. And so to their peers, Pons and Fleischmann were heroes. But to the physicists, they were tourists. A pair of overconfident hucksters messing with things they didn't fully understand. Fritz Will, former president of the Electrochemical Society, recounted a story where a Nobel laureate of physics told him, quote, "Fritz, if cold fusion were ever to be discovered, it wouldn't be discovered by a chemist."
If you look at the confirmations, they come principally from electrochemists rather than from physicists. If you look at the negative criticism, they come principally from physicists.
After people have been studying these reactions for 50 years, and they really have, that somebody at Utah, happens to stumble across a previously unseen low-energy reaction, the odds are pretty small.
Even worse in their eyes was that Pons and Fleischmann had committed two major transgressions. The first was that they had gone to Washington and begged for money from Congress, a blatant attempt to skip over the usual peer-reviewed budgetary process. The second was jumping the gun with a press conference before they published a paper.
And frankly, we're getting a little bit tired of having science done by news conference.
I wonder where your greatest responsibility is. Is it to the general public through a press conference, or is it to the scientific community? And I submit that is the case, that the public had a right to know as soon as possible.
But if most physicists were caught off guard by the announcement, none were more shocked than the physicists working next door to Pons and Fleischmann at the University of Utah. You would think that at least one of them, hopefully a specialist in nuclear science, would have been asked their opinion, but no. Chase Peterson's mandate of secrecy meant that he had really only consulted with two physicists. His VP, James Brophy, an administrator who hadn't done research in years, and a distant relative, Hans Bethe, over at Cornell. When some of those physics profs attempted to speak to Pons directly, they found him in his office, swamped with calls. They were getting messages from physics departments all across the country with the assumption that they had seen and signed off on Pons and Fleischmann's work. They hadn't even seen the paper yet. Now their credibility was on the line, despite having nothing to do with the work. They were not afraid to tell the local news exactly how they felt.
Before you commit yourself publicly and make a big hoopla about it, that you still do the critical work necessary to make sure you're absolutely certain.
They say they're embarrassed by last Thursday's announcement to the world before scientific peer review has had a chance to decide whether this really is or is not a breakthrough.
But even when the paper eventually got published on April 8th, many physicists were shocked by its quality.
The nuclear physics part of the program was not done in a very careful way.
The papers that were written by both groups were papers that, had they been written by my graduate student, I would not have let them publish it. I would have said, go back to the laboratory and finish the job.
The text had several errors and contradictions, all of which suggested to experienced scientists that the paper had been prepared in a rush. Although both clearly intelligent chemists, the general consensus was that Pons and Fleischmann had waded into an area way outside their expertise. Whatever their conclusions, they were almost certainly the result of several blunders. Many physicists didn't even bother reading the paper. They knew for a fact this couldn't be fusion for one very simple reason. They were still alive. Their skin hadn't been irradiated to a crisp. The fusion of two deuterium atoms has been studied since the 1920s and is one of the most well-understood nuclear reactions we know about. As soon as fusion happens, you get an excited helium nucleus with 2 protons and 2 neutrons. But it only lasts for a moment, because it's unstable and will end up decaying into one of 3 radiation branches. In the first branch, the helium loses a neutron and sends it flying. In the second, the helium loses a proton, which leaves an atom of hydrogen with 2 neutrons. This isotope has its own unique name, tritium. The first 2 branches occur approximately 50% of the time. They're evenly split. The third branch is the most rare, with less than 0.5% chance. It stays as a helium-4 atom, but it ejects a super high-energy gamma ray as a photon. All 3 of these branches produce one high-energy radiation particle, either a neutron, tritium, or a gamma ray. In other words, you cannot have heat without radiation alongside it. And remember, according to Fleischmann, they saw 4 watts for every 1 watt they put in. A single fusion reaction would produce about 1 trillionth of a watt, meaning to generate 4 watts, as claimed by Fleischmann, that would be around 2.5 trillion neutrons per second. More than enough to burn the skin off your body. So that begs the question, how many neutrons did they see? Well, in their paper, they reported just 4,000 per second, 1 billion times too low. An amount so low, you'd basically feel no adverse health effects. This issue became known by physicists as the dead grad student problem. The problem was that there wasn't one. If Pons and Fleischmann had spoken to even one physicist at their school, they would have pointed this issue out immediately. But through a combination of overconfidence, ignorance, and the desire for complete secrecy, they didn't ask any of their U of U peers. This is far from the only neutron number that they've shared. At his talk in Dallas, Pons mentioned a figure of 10,000 neutrons per second. And when Pons and Fleischmann recounted their mythical meltdown, they can't get their story straight at all. Fleischmann once said that the meltdown produced, quote, no untoward radiation. And Pons said that there was no noticeable radiation detected. And then even later, they gave a third version, where he said that the lab was, quote, contaminated. Okay, so then which is it? No matter the number, they were anywhere from 1 to 10 billion times fewer neutrons than they should expect. Orders of magnitude upon orders of magnitude. Their method for establishing the background level of radiation was not exactly reliable either. Pons and Fleischmann observed that their neutrons had no clear pattern. They appeared randomly in bursts. But all around us, cosmic rays from outer space result in small, random bursts of neutrons all the time. That is background radiation. A lab underground will have a lower background than one above ground, and even air pressure can have a huge impact. Apparently, to get their background level, they took 2 measurements, one right next to their cell, and then one at a spot 50 meters away. This is not a useful background test because the location is completely different. They should have instead measured the background at the same location once with the cell removed or turned off. Why were they being so vague with their numbers? Well, because they don't usually do this sort of work, they had to borrow a neutron detector. The thing is, the one they borrowed was a medical device, and so was normally used to measure large radiation spikes that might cause a health risk. It's really inaccurate for the low levels they were reporting. And the thing is, they seem to recognize all these issues. They knew their readings were far too low. They say it in the initial press conference.
We have a relatively low rate of production of neutrons, rate of generation of tritium, and the rate of generation of helium-3 is only 1/billionth of what you would expect if the fusion reactions were those experienced in high-energy physics.
But of course, the media covering the story would not have picked up on just how significant that detail was. Even the not-dead grad student himself, Marvin Hawkins, acknowledged this issue as early as April 14th. This is a damning admission. It shows that they were not seeing what theory predicted, but rather than assume they had made a mistake, they made a huge leap in logic, and ran with the idea that maybe the theory wasn't fully correct.
Theories are made to explain experimental data. We have the experimental data and we see no theory for it yet. So they're going to have to rethink some things.
That means there's some additional physics going on in the material that we do not yet understand.
Could it possibly mean there's a mistake?
No.
You're sure that it's right?
I'm sure.
It is a bold strategy to say the least, and one that they were forced to adopt because of their race to beat Stephen Jones. With this in mind, it does reframe Jones's work. Let's put aside the matter of priority for 1 minute. Steve Jones and his team are physicists. They know exactly how many neutrons they should be seeing, and have a state-of-the-art detector to do it. And they did a proper background test. His group was seeing literally just 2 neutrons per hour. Just 2. That is 10,000 times less than the already shockingly low number from Pons and Fleischmann. That amount should work out to just 1 trillionth of a watt, and that's where the distinction between the two groups lay.
Number one, there is fusion, cold nuclear fusion, at a very low level. Number two, the level is not enough to lead us to suspect heat. Therefore, my conclusion is that we don't have heat due to fusion.
I would say that cold fusion is hopeless as a source of energy.
This is a very, very critical difference, and the media coverage in the immediate aftermath did not do a great job of conveying this. Both groups are claiming something remarkable, but only Pons and Fleischmann are arguing this could be a new source of energy. To go back to Jones's favorite analogy, if his claim was $1, theirs was the national debt. He may not have been first, but his results certainly sounded more realistic. Indeed, among physicists, Pons and Fleischmann were viewed largely as quacks, but this Jones fellow, well, maybe there's something there. Although certainly the most obvious problem, the lack of neutrons was not the only issue people saw with the paper. Take the tritium, the other radioactive product you'd expect to see after fusion. In their paper, they reported 10 to 20,000 counts per second. Compared to the neutrons, this was around 10 times as much. But it was still 1 billion times too small to correspond to the heat they saw. It was also weird that they were seeing more tritium than neutrons. The 50-50 branching ratio means you should be seeing pretty much equal amounts. So where else could tritium come from? Tritium, just like neutrons, can be created naturally via cosmic rays. The difference, though, is that this only happens in the upper atmosphere, and even then extremely rarely. However, the U of U chemistry department isn't exactly a good baseline. Labs that often deal with radioactive materials will leave behind radioactive contaminants. Heavy water, although primarily deuterium, will have tritium in it a few times higher than the normal background level. Not to mention, another common lab material is something called tritiated water, where all the hydrogen atoms have been replaced with tritium. It's a notorious contaminant that will get into the air if you're not careful. If you haven't assessed the tritium background before running the experiment, how do you know where the tritium came from? Let's go back to the main reason this is even supposed to work at all. Palladium absorbs deuterium like a sponge. So much deuterium packed so tightly causes astronomical pressures, at least according to Fleischmann. Let's give you a frame of reference. 1 atmosphere of pressure is what most of you are breathing right now. The bottom of the ocean is around 1,000 atmospheres, and the pressure in the core of the sun is 100 billion atmospheres. And yet, Pons and Fleischmann claimed that their palladium rods were experiencing an effective pressure of 10 to the 27 atmospheres.
By compressing deuterium gas, D2, then you would need between 10 to the 26 and 10 to the 27 atmospheres of pressure.
That is 10 quadrillion times more than the core of the sun. This is such a baffling number and should have been a major red flag to either of them. Once again, this was a detail announced in their initial press conference, but the media reporting on it would not have picked up on the absurdity. As it turns out, they had made a basic mistake. They had used the wrong equation. When the correct equation is applied, the pressure in their cells is only 15,000 atmospheres. Higher than ambient, yes, but still far, far too low to enable fusion. But perhaps the most outrageous omission from their experiment was a basic control test. The most primitive control they could have run. Instead of using heavy water, use light water. Use hydrogen instead of deuterium. If heavy water produced excess heat and light water didn't, then it was solid proof that fusion was behind the heat. But if light water also produced excess heat, it would suggest that there was some sort of mistake in their heat measurements.
Wow.
Pons and
That's
Fleischmann
so fucking bad.
had simply
God
not
damn
done a light water control. We
damn
know this because Fleischmann was asked this exact question by the director of CERN, Carlo Rubio, at a publicly recorded talk. This is the actual audio of their exchange.
Martin, if you don't allow me to do that, by asking you a direct question, namely, all this is done with deuterium in the water. Did you ever try to do the same experiment, replacing deuterated water with ordinary water? If you do so, what happens?
I must confess to you that those experiments are just going on now. And we will hope to give you that answer very shortly. The reason we haven't done so is that if you do that experiment, you do in fact ruin the electrodes. And we have so far had very limited resources.
Those who were present recall that several people gasped. His answer effectively boils down to, we didn't have time or money. But this just doesn't line up. They have said repeatedly that they started experiments in 1984, almost 5 years ago, and they didn't run a light water control even once? In the press conference, he said this.
We have tried very hard to prove ourselves wrong, all the way down the line.
Evidently, they didn't try hard enough. According to Marvin Hawkins, they didn't start running light water tests until late April, almost an entire month after they had announced to the world their breakthrough discovery. On April 9th, Stan Pons will claim that he ran light water controls. We know this because Chuck Martin, a good friend of Stanley Pons, called him up about an experiment that he had run.
What had happened was that Chuck Martin was doing experiments with both heavy water and light water. We now know what was incorrect with that particular experiment, that he had a bad earth connection to a thermometer, so power was entering the cell through the thermometer and heating it up, which was not, of course, in the book balancing. And he called up Stan Pons this weekend, immediately before that date, and said, we're seeing heat with heavy water, we're really excited. And Pons said, that's great, I knew that somebody was going to reproduce it soon, I'm glad it was you. And then Martin said to him, but we have a problem, we are also seeing heat with light water. And Pons said, that's the most exciting thing, we see it too.
When he's asked if he's run a light water control at the ACS meeting in Dallas, he responds, quote, a baseline reaction run with water is not necessarily a good baseline. We do not get the total blank experiment we expected. It is a cryptic way to answer that question, but reading between the lines, one can imagine that he was hoping for a different result. Later, on April 20th, Nature will publicly refuse to publish the paper submitted to them by Pons and Fleischmann, as all three of its reviewers have been highly critical, and they focused in on the lack of a light water control. If they had truly been working on this for 5 entire years, how had they not once run a light water control? Pons was indignant. Quote, I'll argue that the control is taking a palladium rod that absolutely does not work and place that side by side to an experiment that is, in the same solution, and that is a control experiment. It's never done anything there but sit at you. This is nonsensical. You can only know that a palladium rod doesn't work until after you've tested it, by which point it can't be a control. Unless there is some measurable difference between the working and non-working palladium, this is worthless. And on April 25th, the Wall Street Journal will report that Mr. Pons says he has a plain water experiment producing small, unmeasured amounts of heat. In summary, we really have no idea what their light water result was because Pons and Fleischmann don't seem to know either.
The referees in that journal, that is the people who decide whether to allow that article to be published or not, said they needed more information. The Utah group said, hey, listen, we don't have the time, we don't want to go through the trouble right now to provide you with information, give us our paper back, we won't even be bothered.
He also got Gary Triggs to send Nature a threatening letter. In a move that likely stung quite a bit, Nature did say that they would publish Stephen Jones's paper. A mistake is not the same thing as fraud. You can unknowingly make an error. If you find out later that you made a mistake, the proper course of action is to come out publicly, admit it, and either retract or correct it. Embarrassing, yes, but certainly not unethical. Where it turns into fraud is when you deliberately try to cover up that mistake. Just a couple weeks after their paper was published, they released an errata, adding the name of Mark Hawkins. But in that same errata, they also changed a graph. They did not provide a reason why. If they had, it would have raised alarm bells. Unfortunately for them, at least one person had been paying close attention. On May 1st, a Boston Herald story is printed that quotes MIT physicist Ronald Parker, calling the work, quote, scientific schlock and possibly misrepresentation and maybe fraud. A few weeks earlier, Parker's group had attempted to repeat the experiment but hadn't seen any evidence of neutrons.
Our analysis indicates it's likely that
many, many fewer neutrons were observed than claimed, if any at all.
Although they said they would keep at it. But this headline was a clear step up from the previous statement. Parker, likely fearing that he might get sued, later tried to deny that he said any such thing despite his interview being recorded. Given Pons' tendency to sick Gary Triggs on people, he was probably right to be worried.
MIT is used to being right on top of every scientific discovery just as it happens. That increases their frustration.
But his reasons to suspect frauds seemed to be justified, thanks to a tip from a colleague named Richard Petrasso. Petrasso had stumbled onto a highly suspicious piece of data in the paper. In his eyes, cold fusion was a ridiculous claim. It was, quote, just glib bullshit as far as we know. The only piece of evidence that made him remotely interested was the gamma ray spectra. Fusion is supposed to emit neutrons. That much you know by now. Because they were short on funds, Pons and Fleischmann borrowed a low-sensitivity neutron dosimeter. All this detector could do was count neutrons. They don't tell you anything about where those neutrons came from. If we could measure the energy of those neutrons, we could be far more certain they're coming from fusion. And so, we want to look for gamma rays. Gamma rays are high-energy photons, typically emitted by a radioactive source. By measuring all the gamma rays in a lab, you can plot them on an energy spectrum. It will have a sloping background level with lots of distinct peaks jutting up. Each peak is associated with well-known energy levels. This peak at 1.46 MeV, for instance, comes from radioactive potassium, which is present in the environment and also your body. Same with this peak at 2.62 MeV, which comes from radioactive thallium. There is also a peak that can prove fusion is occurring. When a neutron is emitted into a water bath, it will gradually slow down until it collides with a proton and become captured by it. This emits a gamma ray. And its energy level is extremely precise. It is 2.224 MeV with very little wiggle room. A gamma ray from fusion should look like this, a peak at exactly 2.224. And in the paper published by Pons and Fleischmann, that's exactly what you see. A peak in almost the exact right spot. Except there was an earlier draft of this graph. In both their submissions to the Journal of Electroanalytic Chemistry and Nature, they had submitted a graph with a peak way to the right at 2.5 MeV. There is no relevant radiation phenomena that occurs at 2.5. It is just straight up the wrong value. Pons and Fleischmann might have realized this if they had asked even just one colleague in U of U's physics department. Indeed, if the Journal of Electroanalytical Chemistry hadn't rushed the peer review process, they would have sent it out to a reviewer with knowledge of nuclear physics, who would have caught this problem and likely rejected the paper. Ultimately, though, the graph with 2.5 was never made public, because on March 28th, Fleischmann was giving a talk in the UK at Harwell Labs, and the audience members there immediately recognized the peak as a mistake. Later that day, he told Pons over the phone, and Pons then submitted a new graph with the peak moved to 2.22. Not just that, though. The y-axis had been scaled from 20,000 down to 2,200, just 10% of what it used to be. In the facts he sent to Nature, he did not explain the reason for this correction. This, of course, is all behind the scenes, not public knowledge. When the paper was eventually published, the only hint that something had changed is that an equation still had 2.5 in it. Without knowing that the graph had been changed, people thought this was just a typo. Richard Petrasso initially thought the same, but fortunately for him, he happened to have friends who worked at Nature who had seen the original graph, and they let him know that the peak had changed. Now, Petrasso thinks that there is something highly suspicious going on, but beyond that, the new graph had other problems. For one, it was far too zoomed in. Sure, there may be something at 2.22, but unless you can see the full range of energies, you can't tell if it's a signal or if it's noise. The shape of the peak also looked weird. It's about half as wide as it should be. And there are distinct features that were missing to the left of the peak. There should be a slope known as the Compton edge. And even further left, there should be a bump known as the first escape peak. The Pons and Fleischmann graph lacked both of those. Petrasso wondered if there was a copy of the full spectrum somewhere. Luckily for him, Pons and Fleischmann had let a bunch of Utah news stations come in and film their lab. And so, he went and scoured every news clip he could find until he found a clip from CNN. In it was a computer screen with the full spectrum. Because he knows exactly where the peaks for potassium and thallium should be, Petrasso was able to scale the rest of the spectrum. And lo and behold, when he looked for the so-called fusion peak, it was at 2.5 and not 2.22. Petrasso began phoning people at U of U to get more info. He even sent a student to Salt Lake City just to see if any more news channels had more footage. Marvin Hawkins confirmed to Petrasso that the peak was originally measured at 2.5. But he wasn't the only person who backed that up. Pons had needed help with the gamma ray measurements, and so he had asked a medical radiation physicist named Robert Hoffman to perform them. In fact, Hoffman, just like Hawkins, had his name left off the paper at the last minute, a move that felt like a personal slight. After the press conference, Hoffman refused to work with Pons and Fleischmann ever again. Hoffman later ran some new tests and came to the conclusion that an issue with the preamplifier in the circuit caused artifacts in his spectrum. He wrote a letter on April 27th to Pons where he stated that there was no evidence for anything at 2.2 and that the 2.5 peak was an artifact. He was essentially retracting his data from their paper despite being left off as an author. Petrasso was outraged. With no explanation, Pons and Fleischmann appeared to have fabricated a critical piece of evidence. He began to write a paper lambasting them, which he would later submit to Nature. He was reportedly so angry about this that the original draft of his letter was so emotional he needed a colleague to help him tone it down. Nature will reach out to Pons for comment, and after he doesn't reply for weeks, they gave him a deadline. His response was apparently so volatile, Nature declined to publish it. Petrasso's paper is published on May 18th. It will be a crushing blow to Pons and Fleischmann's credibility, an indisputable smoking gun. Gary Triggs will later attempt to block the paper, but this amounts to little more than idle threats. But Petrasso's paper wouldn't matter. That's one of the ironies of this story. Scientists knew just how damning the gamma rays were, but to the media, it was just one of a dozen other criticisms flying around. Really, the media only paid attention an entire year later, when a book by Frank Close exposed behind-the-scenes shenanigans, and he heavily implied fraud, or at least as far as UK libel law allowed him to.
So I then spoke to Marvin Hawkins, the graduate student, and he didn't know either. And I said, let's get this straight. I said, it's clear that the peak was measured at 2.5. There are 4 people involved in this experiment. Fleischmann doesn't know how it's moved. Hoffman doesn't know how it's moved. Now you're telling me that you don't know how it's moved. And he said, I think you've got the picture now.
But by that point, it didn't matter. Cold fusion had been dead for a year.
5 laboratories have successfully repeated the experiment. 6 others have failed.
Tonight, other scientists at MIT and elsewhere are saying they have evidence suggesting there was no fusion.
For now, at least, the skeptics seem to outnumber the believers in the San Francisco Bay Area, where so many top-ranked scientists work.
And a Duke scientist says the problem with Pons and Fleischmann's work is that it amounts to sloppy science versus reproducible science. 2 groups of scientists at the University of Michigan announced today that they have found no evidence to confirm claims of a fusion reaction.
But back here in this country, a spokesman for the Los Alamos labs is denying earlier reports that scientists there were close to repeating the experiment.
Weeks earlier, lab after lab announced that they had confirmed part of cold fusion. But by now, just as many labs had declared the exact opposite. They couldn't see enough neutrons, tritium, or any gamma rays. For physicists, any of those 3 would be the gold standard proof of fusion, and yet they did not see them. But for chemists, the most compelling piece of evidence had always been the calorimetry, the heat. After all, if we go all the way back to 1985, we have the original piece of evidence that was so convincing, so unambiguous, that it swayed both Pons and Fleischmann into believing they had seen something nuclear. The mythical meltdown. A 1 centimeter cube of palladium had melted and left a hole in the lab bench and concrete. They could think of no chemical reaction that could cause so much damage, produce so much heat. It had to be nuclear. But the thing is, no one actually witnessed the event itself. All we know is that the cube melted. By this point, plenty of theories have been put forward that weren't so mythical. If you have a partially enclosed container that is slowly being filled with oxygen and hydrogen gas, and a bunch of it leaks out of the palladium all at once, all you'd need was a rogue spark, and you'd go up like a Hindenburg. And as we saw before, at least 2 labs, Livermore in California and North Carolina U, called off their experiments because they had explosions. And their conclusions were that they had accidentally caused traditional chemical explosions. Nothing nuclear about it. Pons and Fleischmann have said repeatedly they could not think of a single non-nuclear explanation for the heat that they saw. They'd had 5 years to ponder this issue. Maybe they just lacked imagination. Even besides the meltdown, Pons and Fleischmann said that they had seen 300% excess heat. 4 watts out for every 1 watt in. It was those numbers that made the news. Those numbers that convinced the world the era of fossil fuels may come to an end far sooner than expected. But there was at least one chemist, one electrochemist in fact, who seriously doubted those numbers as well. Nathan Lewis was a 33-year-old professor at Caltech, with a solid reputation among his peers, especially for his age. Chuck Martin, a friend of both him and Stanley Pons, said, quote, "I'm not as young as Nate, and nobody's as smart as Nate." He called him, quote, "one of the most fiercely competitive son of a bitches you'll ever meet." On March 23rd, when cold fusion was announced to the world, Chuck Martin had phoned Lewis's wife and frantically told her to record it on CNN. Nate absolutely needed to see this. Lewis's group at Caltech had been trying to replicate cold fusion since day one. Initially, Lewis let his postdocs do most of the work, as at first he was highly skeptical. He told them they were allowed at most a single day. But after talking to some peers and hearing more about Pons and Fleischmann, he figured maybe there was something to this. Quote, "They're a little flaky, but they're not crazy. I don't know what to think." What really got him interested was talking to a Caltech physicist named Steve Koonin, who told him about the extremely similar work by Steve Jones at BYU, who was known to be a fusion expert. The scandalous backstory there wasn't public yet, so to Lewis, this seemed like 2 groups independently stumbling onto the same thing. And so he directed his group to try and take a real crack at this thing. As the frenzy around cold fusion grew, Lewis's team grew to 15 chemists and physicists working side by side. Their neutron detector was around 100,000 times more sensitive than the one used in the Utah work. But they could only do so much when the paper lacked experimental details. There was no calibration data for the calorimeter. In fact, the paper didn't list even a single temperature reading. It only reported results in terms of watts of power. Lewis had personally emailed Pons asking for more info, even just a preprint of the paper. Pons called him and was friendly, but said he'd have to wait for a copy. Lewis asked for anything, just anything he could give him, and Pons only gave him a cryptic warning. Quote, "Be careful. We've had explosions. I don't want you to hurt yourself. I want you to be careful." As for what to avoid, Pons only offered this: avoid high current and sharp edges. Lewis and his group would have to push forward using their best guesses. Weeks go by and they see nothing, and through the grapevine, they hear about some folks at MIT who think the gamma ray data is highly suspect. Lewis is convinced that this has all been a wild goose chase.
This is the Caltech cold fusion group, which of course was one of the major anti-groups.
But even at this point, he wasn't willing to go public against it yet. Steve Koonin had invited him to speak at the upcoming American Physical Society meeting in Baltimore. This was going to be the physics equivalent of the Woodstock-level meeting in Dallas. Lewis initially declined the offer, but one night, he stayed up late to watch the congressional hearing on C-SPAN. It was there he saw the University of Utah ask for $25 million for unproven research. And it was also where Fleischmann divulged a piece of information that had not been public before. A comment so innocuous that no one in the room caught its significance. But Lewis did. And it was so offensive that he decided he couldn't sit back anymore. He phoned Steve Koonin back. He was going to speak in Baltimore after all.